At the dawn of World War II, France unveiled a masterpiece of defensive engineering, an impenetrable wall of steel and concrete so advanced that German officers privately admitted they couldn't break it. And then, France left a 90-mile gap at one end and hoped no one would notice. So, what strategic universe were they operating in, where a fortress is impenetrable, except the part where the enemy can just walk around it? This episode breaks down how the French built one of the most sophisticated defense systems in modern history, only to have it bypassed in weeks thanks to political hesitation, flawed assumptions, and a series of leadership decisions that aged about as well as wet cardboard. An expert breakdown of a failure that absolutely should never have happened. France emerged from World War I devastated, traumatized, and deeply convinced of one thing: never again would German troops simply march across the border. So in the late 1920s, they engineered the Maginot Line. Hundreds of miles of underground fortresses, artillery posts, rail lines, barracks, and command centers. It was so advanced that foreign observers called it the future of warfare. And then came the first major oversight. The entire concept assumed the next war would look exactly like the last one. Narrator aside, because, as history has repeatedly shown, the enemy always cooperates with your predictions. The planners built for a static, trench-based conflict, convinced mobility was a fad rather than the defining feature of the next war. Internal French military memos from 1932 openly dismissed the possibility of a rapid, mechanized thrust through the Ardennes. Too difficult, not tank country, and impractical for large forces. Meanwhile, German reconnaissance quietly cataloged every passable route. Here was the second catastrophic decision. France simply did not extend the Maginot Line through the Ardennes Forest. Why? A cocktail of political bargaining, overconfidence in terrain, and Belgian diplomatic pressure. The Belgian government didn't want a wall on their border. It looked hostile. So France pulled the fortifications back. This created a lightly defended stretch that became the single most critical vulnerability of 1940. Narrator aside, a small gap in your multi-billion-franc defense system. What could possibly go wrong? French commanders deployed only 6 poorly supported divisions to cover the Ardennes, units that were neither mechanized nor prepared for high-speed assaults. Some had no anti-tank guns newer than 1918 designs. Inside war plans, the French General Staff labeled the Ardennes low risk. Germany labeled it main route of attack. The Maginot Line wasn't just a military project, it was political theater. French leaders needed public reassurance after World War I, and massive fortresses delivered exactly that. But while the public saw security, the high command saw a budget black hole. The army spent so much on static defenses that mobile forces, tanks, trucks, and radios lagged painfully behind. By 1939, German armored divisions had radios in nearly every tank. French armored units often had one radio per company. Narrator aside. After all, who needs real-time communication when you have a very nice, very expensive underground bunker? A 1938 logistics report noted that 35% of French tanks could not travel more than 30 miles without major maintenance. The Maginot Line, by contrast, had its own subterranean electric railway, running perfectly. To be fair, the Maginot Line itself performed exactly as designed. When German forces probed the fortifications in Alsace and Lorraine, they were stopped cold. The artillery turrets, armored cloches, and underground barracks were engineering marvels. But warfare had moved on. Instead of smashing the wall, Germany executed a textbook example of maneuver warfare. Strike where the defenses aren't, and then drive deep into command and supply hubs before the enemy can react. By May 15, 1940, German panzers were 50 miles through the Ardennes and moving faster than French headquarters could process battlefield reports. And this is where it truly falls apart. French command posts still relied heavily on telephones and motorcycle couriers, systems that collapsed under the pace of German breakthroughs. One Corps HQ received word of an entire division's retreat 6 hours after it happened. When German armor burst out of the Ardennes, French and British forces attempted a counterattack, but coordination between the two armies was disjointed at best, adversarial at worst. Leadership disagreements between French General Gamelin and British General Edmund Ironside meant that units frequently acted on contradictory orders. Some French formations launched attacks without air support, others waited for reinforcements that never came. Because nothing says joint operation like two commanders politely pretending the other doesn't exist. The French 3rd DCR, or Armored Division, counterattacked with 160 tanks but no infantry support. They inflicted losses but were eventually isolated and forced to withdraw. Communications failures again. By late May, the German breakthrough had split Allied forces in half. The Maginot Line garrisons, which had been told they were part of an impregnable defense, were now being surrounded from behind. Many units held out for weeks, fighting bravely and efficiently, but the strategic situation was hopeless. The line had been designed to channel the enemy, not to withstand encirclement. But that was only the beginning. Some forts continued firing even as German troops bypassed them entirely. In a surreal twist, a few Maginot garrisons surrendered days after the armistice because their commanders never received official confirmation that France had fallen. Imagine building the strongest walls in Europe and then not hearing the war ended because the phone lines were cut. The fall of France reshaped global strategy for decades. Nations realized static defenses alone could never guarantee security again. The Maginot Line became synonymous with outdated thinking, inflexibility, and the dangers of preparing for the last war instead of the next. Yet many of its engineering principles, subterranean logistics, hardened positions, layered defense, remain relevant. It wasn't the fortifications that failed, it was the strategy behind them. The Maginot Line was a masterpiece used in the wrong war. In the end, France did not lose because its walls were weak. It lost because its assumptions were. So let me ask you this. If you were advising French command in 1936, what single strategic decision would you change first? This is Conflict Genesis. We'll see you in the next unraveling.